Every December, the eyes of the world turn to Stockholm. We celebrate the poets who move our souls, the peacemakers who stop wars, and the scientists who cure diseases. It is a ritual of human excellence, sanctified by the last will and testament of Alfred Nobel himself. But there is one prize that sits awkwardly at this table, a prize that Alfred Nobel never asked for. A prize established not by a philanthropist, but by a bank, specifically the Sveriges Riksbank, Sweden's central bank, in 1968. Why does this distinction matter? Because while other prizes celebrate discovery, the economics prize often celebrates control. It rewards the mechanics of how we organize societies, how we distribute wealth, and most importantly, how we make decisions. And in 2004, the bank gave its money to two men who discovered a terrifying truth about those decisions. Their names were Kydland from Norway and Edward Prescott from the United States. On the surface, their citation was dry enough to cure insomnia. For their contributions to dynamic macroeconomics, the time consistency of economic policy, and the driving forces behind business cycles. But don't let the academic jargon fool you. What Kydland and Prescott actually did was mathematically prove that your government cannot be trusted. Not because they are evil, not because they are incompetent, but because they are rational. They exposed a fundamental flaw in human planning called the time consistency problem. It is a paradox that explains why parents fail to discipline their children, why teachers fail to grade fairly, and why central bankers, despite their best intentions, often drive economies off a cliff. Before 2004, or rather before the papers they wrote in the late 70s, economists believed that if you elected smart people and gave them the power to choose the best policy for every situation, you would get the best results. It sounds obvious, right? Flexibility is good. Rigidity is bad. Kydland and Prescott said no. They argued that the ability to choose is actually a curse. They showed that the optimal plan for tomorrow becomes the suboptimal plan when tomorrow actually arrives. This implies that the only way to succeed is to remove the option of choice altogether, to tie your own hands, to replace discretion with rules. So over the next 20 minutes, we are going to deconstruct this Nobel Prize-winning idea. We are going to explore why lying is sometimes the most rational thing a leader can do, and how this theory rewrote the constitution of modern banking. We will answer three critical questions. Question 1. Why is the best policy for the future always the worst policy for the present? We'll call this the trap of discretion. Question 2. How did Kydland and Prescott prove that commitment, even to a painful rule, yields better results than flexibility? This is the mechanism of rules. Question 3. Did this theory actually work, or did it just hand over our economies to unfeeling robots? This is the reality check. To understand why Kydland and Prescott's idea was so revolutionary, we first have to understand the world they destroyed. A world built on a very seductive idea: flexibility. Imagine you are the captain of a ship sailing through a storm. Would you want to be forced to follow a route you planned 3 months ago, back when the skies were clear? Or would you want the power to spin the wheel right now, reacting to every wave and every gust of wind? The answer seems obvious. You want control. You want the option to change your mind. In economics, we call this discretionary policy. For decades, this was the gold standard of governance. The logic often associated with the great John Maynard Keynes was simple. The economy is a machine. Sometimes it runs too hot, sometimes it runs too cold. Therefore, the government needs a technician, a benevolent expert standing at the control panel, turning the knobs. If unemployment rises, print a little money to stimulate demand. If prices rise, raise taxes to cool it down. This view treats economic policy as a series of isolated, one-time games. In every period, the policymaker looks at the situation as it is, ignores the past, and chooses the absolute best action for that specific moment. It sounds perfect. It sounds responsible. Why would anyone ever want to tie their own hands? Why would a general promise never to retreat, even if retreat saves his army? Why would a central banker promise never to print money, even if printing money prevents a depression? Under this old framework, commitment, sticking to a rule, looked like stupidity. It looked like a lack of imagination. If you are smart, you keep your options open. You maximize social welfare period by period. This was the consensus. It was elegant, it was mathematical, and it had just one tiny problem. It didn't work. The beautiful theory of discretion crashed headfirst into the reality of the 1970s. This was the era of stagflation. According to the old textbooks, this wasn't supposed to happen. You were supposed to have high inflation or high unemployment. Never both. But despite governments furiously turning their control knobs, printing money to create jobs, then cutting spending to fight inflation, the economy just got worse. It was like driving a car where turning the steering wheel left made the car go right. Why? This is where Kydland and Prescott stepped in and pointed out the fatal flaw in the economy as a machine metaphor. Machines don't think. If you push a lever on a toaster, the toaster doesn't wonder, why is he doing that? Is he trying to trick me? But people do. Kydland and Prescott argued that economic policy is not a game of solitaire. It is a game of poker. And the other players at the table, the workers, the companies, the investors, they know your cards. Here represents the anomaly. Policymakers thought they could surprise the public. They thought, we will promise low inflation, but then, surprise, we will print a little extra money to boost employment. But the public isn't stupid. They realized that the government, being rational and flexible, would always be tempted to print that extra money. Because politicians always want a short-term boom before an election. So, anticipating the government's move, workers demanded higher wages in advance. Companies raised prices in advance. The result? The surprise stimulus didn't create any new jobs because prices had already adjusted. All the government achieved was higher inflation. By trying to be flexible, they achieved absolutely nothing but failure. The anomaly was clear. The more power you have to fix a problem, the less likely you are to solve it. To see this mechanism in real life, forget banks for a moment. Let's talk about real estate. Imagine a government that wants to stop people from building houses in a dangerous flood zone. The government uses discretion. They announce a policy. Go ahead and build if you want. But we promise, if a flood comes, we will not use taxpayer money to save you. You are on your own. This is the logical plan. If people believe it, they won't build there. They will move to safe ground. Problem solved, right? Wrong. The citizens are rational. They look forward to the future. They visualize the flood. They see the CNN cameras arriving. They see images of families shivering on rooftops. They know that in that emotional moment, no democratic government can stand by and say, sorry, remember the rule we made 5 years ago? No, the government will send the helicopters. The government will send the checks. Because the government has discretion, the power to choose, they are trapped by their own benevolence. Because the citizens know the government will cave in, they ignore the warning. They build the houses. The flood comes. The bailout happens. We get the worst of both worlds, expensive disaster relief and dangerous housing. So what is the Kydland-Prescott solution? You don't make a promise. You pass a law. You build a wall. You make it physically or legally impossible for the government to send money. By removing the option to be nice, you force people to be safe. This logic that rules out performed discretion because they anchor expectations is exactly what they were awarded for in 2004. To see why the theory of time consistency matters, we must travel back to the economic crime scene, the United States, late 1970s. The Federal Reserve, led by Arthur Burns, was playing the ultimate game of discretion. They believed they could fine-tune the economy like a stereo system. The logic was standard Keynesianism. If unemployment ticks up, we will lower interest rates just a bit to boost jobs. If inflation ticks up, we will raise them just a bit to cool prices. It was a sensible plan, but remember the time inconsistency trap? The public knew that Arthur Burns was a nice guy. They knew he faced immense political pressure to keep jobs plentiful before elections. So every time the Fed promised, we are serious about fighting inflation now, the unions and businesses replied, no, you're not. They expected the Fed to cave in. They expected the Fed to choose the optimal short-term policy of printing money to avoid a recession. Because they didn't believe the promise, they raised wages and prices before the money was even printed. The result was a catastrophe called stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment. The Fed had lost its most valuable asset, credibility. Their flexibility had become their weakness. The economy was spinning out of control because the captain refused to lock the steering wheel. The world needed someone to prove Kydland and Prescott right. They needed someone to tie their own hands. Enter the giant. In 1979, Paul Volcker became chairman of the Fed. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the living embodiment of Kydland and Prescott's Nobel Prize winning theory. Volcker did something radical. He effectively tied his own hands. He announced that the Fed would no longer target interest rates to smooth out the economy. Instead, they would target the money supply alone. This was a rule, a cold, hard mathematical rule. It meant that if inflation was high, interest rates would go up to 20%, destroying businesses, destroying mortgages, destroying jobs. And Volcker would do absolutely nothing to stop it. The pain was excruciating. It was the deepest recession since the Great Depression. But remember the time consistency mechanism? Because Volcker refused to pivot, because he showed he was willing to let the economy bleed, the market finally believed him. The expectations snapped. Workers stopped demanding 15% raises. Companies stopped raising prices. Inflation collapsed from 14% to 3% in just a few years. By removing his own discretion, Volcker didn't just kill inflation. He bought the United States 25 years of stability, known as the Great Moderation. This historical victory proved the core of the 2004 Nobel Prize. To create a stable future, a leader must sometimes be immune to the suffering of the present. So why should you, watching this in 2025, care about two economists from 2004? Because the time consistency shield they built is currently under attack. For the last 30 years, the Kydland Prescott logic gave us central bank independence. We separated the people who spend the money, politicians, from the people who print the money, central bankers. It was a separation of powers designed to prevent the rational cheating we discussed earlier. But today we are seeing the rise of fiscal dominance. Governments around the world have borrowed so much money that the interest payments alone are becoming unmanageable. This creates a new time consistency trap. Politicians are now looking at central banks and saying, "We know you have a rule against inflation, but if you don't print money to pay our debts, the whole government goes bankrupt." The market is watching. Just like in the 1970s, investors are asking, will the central bank stick to the Kydland-Prescott rule, or will they blink? If they blink, if they choose the discretionary path of bailing out the government to avoid short-term pain, then the anchor is gone. Your savings, your wages, and your purchasing power will be the victims of the rational choice to inflate away the debt. The lesson from 2004 is terrifyingly simple. The moment you start believing that rules can be broken just this once for an emergency, you have already lost the game. Kydland and Prescott didn't just win a prize for explaining the past. They gave us the only roadmap to survive the future. The question is, are our leaders still reading the map? Now, before we conclude, we must add a layer of nuance. Kydland and Prescott did not argue that politicians should be replaced by unfeeling algorithms. They understood that the world is unpredictable. If a meteor hits the Earth or a global pandemic shuts down the world, sticking to a rigid rule like never print money would be suicide. Sometimes the house is on fire and you have to break the window. However, their contribution, the reason they hold that medal from the Sveriges Riksbank, is forcing us to admit that these emergencies are rare, and that for 99% of history, the greatest danger to the economy is not a meteor. It is our own lack of discipline. In Greek mythology, Odysseus ordered his men to tie him to the mast of his ship so he could hear the siren song without steering the ship into the rocks. He knew that his future self would be weak, so his present self created a constraint. Kydland and Prescott taught us that nations must do the same. We must build institutions that protect us from our own good intentions. Because in the end, the economy is not a machine you control. It is a relationship based on trust. And as any relationship counselor will tell you, trust is not built on flexibility. It is built on keeping your promises, even when it hurts. That is the paradox of the 2004 Nobel Prize. Sometimes the only way to be truly free is to tie your own hands. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand more about the real business cycles part of their prize, let us know in the comments. See you in the next one.